Throughout the month of February, we've been focusing on the topic of relationships. We're going to continue that focus today as we look at how Apostle Paul instructed early churches to address their relationship problems. Problems that stemmed from Paul's plan that the church be inclusive, even in situations of extreme diversity. Today we hear from Paul, as usual, from one of his letters. In this case, Paul's letter to the Roman church. Rome was the capital of the Western world at that point in history, the biggest military and economic power of its time, much like Washington, D.C. is seen today. So Paul put a lot of effort into this letter. If the church could grow in Rome, it could grow anywhere. Paul's letter to the Romans was, at least at some part, dealing with questions of diversity and inclusion. Who could be part of the church? Should the church in Rome be inclusive? And if so, how would it handle the extreme diversity of big city Rome and still remain together? This was important to Paul because he wanted everyone to experience the spiritual transformation that he had experienced in Jesus Christ. But it's important to note that Paul's teachings about inclusion, that he differentiates between including all people and including all behaviors. And we still struggle with that today. We don't always know the difference between a type of person and behavior. Paul taught that while everyone should be included in the church, that does not mean, however, that all behaviors are helpful or that all behaviors are Christ-like. To Paul, improved behavior or more loving behavior is a natural result of a direct experience of Jesus Christ. A positive change in a person's behavior is the natural result of the change in heart that we experience as we move from being self-focused to becoming Christ or love-focused. And Paul feels that this change of heart is available to everyone. Now, in the Roman church, the big argument of the time was whether or not the church could accept both Jews and pagans. And not just accept them, but affirm them and figure out how such different kinds of people could work together as one church. To allow such different people to take part in one church, Paul lays out what Christ-like behavior should look like based on his own experience. Inclusion in the context of a church means including as many people as possible, but it doesn't mean being inclusive of every behavior and certainly not abusive or violent behavior. In Paul's time, Jews and Gentiles were different in so many ways that seeing past their differences in behaviors seemed nearly impossible. It had been much easier to have separate churches, one for the Jews, another for the Romans, another one for the Greeks, etc. But that kind of thinking, that kind of division was not consistent with Paul's experience of Christ. Paul hoped he could create one diverse church that would become an expression of Christ's love in the world. Within an inclusive church, Paul hoped that very different kinds of people would learn from each other and truly love each other as neighbors. Paul's teachings on behavior was based on his own behavior after his transformative experience of Christ. For example, Paul teaches the church in Rome to bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Bless those who persecute you. Paul himself had experienced this. Right? Paul had been blessed by a Christian who was being tortured to death. And that impacted Paul deeply. Recall that before Paul's conversion to Christianity, that he himself had been a violent persecutor of Christians. The book of Acts talks about one of these violent encounters that Paul had been involved in, the stoning death of a man named Stephen. Stephen was a spiritually gifted follower of Christ. Stephen had become a leader in the distribution of food and charities and charitable aid to poorer members in the community. In modern terminology, Stephen's work was in pursuit of equity for the poor. Stephen's heart for the poor made him an excellent example of Christ-like behavior. Stephen was captured by the Roman authorities, and he was put to death. Actually, was captured by the Jewish authorities, and was put to death for the crime of following Christ's example on behalf of the poor. And Paul was there. And as Stephen is being stoned to death, Paul is standing there. Throw another one. And watched him die. And as Paul watches Stephen being violently killed repeatedly, hit with stones, Stephen follows Christ's example. You remember Christ from the cross says, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." Stephen does the same thing. He prays with his dying words that his killers be forgiven. Stephen, even as people are killing him, had blessed Paul and the others involved in his death. This impacted Paul deeply, preparing him to meet Jesus on the road to Damascus. So Paul knew something about persecution and the impact of Stephen's blessings. So in this passage, Paul is saying, be like Stephen, be like Christ, bless those who persecute you. It was an example of love and forgiveness that Paul would never forget. Paul goes on to teach that we should weep with those who weep. We should rejoice with those who rejoice. We should live in harmony with all people, even people who are fundamentally different from us. Even and particularly people we look down on. See, that's the problem. The Jews look down on the Gentiles. The Gentiles look down on the Jews. They pretty much all look down on the poor. This is a common human experience, a common human challenge. How do we handle it when we see someone else as less than or as outside of God's plan of love? Well, Paul teaches us to actively live in harmony with such people, which means having a healthy relationship with each other. And not just an attitude, not just something on the surface. It's deeper than that, what Paul is talking about. It's loving your neighbor deep. To live in harmony with those that we look down on, with those we dislike. I mean, we're each individuals, right? We're each unique. And we each live out God's given free will in different ways. And while ideally we're going to get along with most people, few of us are actually compatible with everyone. Still, we can't always control who we like and don't like. We can control our behavior towards individuals in the ways that Paul recommends. And it's not just an individual issue either. We tend to look down on or dislike entire groups of people. For example, we still, as a human society, often dislike or look down on poor people, both individually and as a group, usually blaming them for being poor. Or we look down on somebody because of their race, or we look down on someone because of their religion. And what do we do when we realize we're doing that? When we catch ourselves doing that? When we discover we're looking down on an entire group and considering them as less than, considering them as lowly, as undeserving. In the modern world, we might call this bigotry. The very common tendency to harshly judge others based on their group. And Paul tries to address this first by cautioning us not to be haughty or get off your high horse. Don't assume that others are beneath you. Paul teaches that looking down on an individual or group of people is not Christ-like behavior, and that and if you find that you look down on individuals or groups, then Paul offers a solution. Paul says, associate with them. He says, associate with the lowly. Associate those who you look down on, which, by the way, is a very different message than we saw in the Old Testament passage that we heard first. Paul is pointing to another way forward. And not to associate with the lowly and condescending ways, not in a way that emphasizes your superiority or that expresses disdain, but in a compassionate way, a way that is sensitive to the humanity in others. This is notable advice from Paul. It sort of says, if you don't get along with someone because they belong to a group that you look down on, the solution lies in changing yourself, not in changing them, not in changing somebody else. And the way to facilitate that change in ourselves is by association, by getting to know and understand how others experience the world. The answer to bringing Jews and Gentiles together is found in this wisdom. With empathy, taking a few steps in their shoes, walking with them, not over them. By associating with the lowly, with people we might have a tendency to look down on, we learn how to develop a healthy relationship with such individuals and eventually to stop looking down on them as a group. Paul is describing to us how his own behavior patterns changed due to experience of Christ. Paul used to see Christians as lowly. Paul, as a Pharisee, thought he was so wise. But then Christ touched his heart. Right? Paul is not prescribing rules or laws, but rather he's describing how he deals with relationship issues after his spiritual experience of Christ. And by the way, how Paul deals with people is part of why he was able to start so many churches. It opened people's eyes. When we've reached a certain level of spiritual maturity, this is how we'll act. It'll be natural for us. Spiritual maturity changes us in deep and impactful ways. And then Paul makes that point with an even more difficult challenge. Paul says, do not repay evil for evil. Paul says instead of repaying evil for evil or repaying violence with violence, that we should repay evil with what is noble in the sight of all. To respond to an evil in a way that's honorable to all, even honorable to the person who did evil in the first place. This can be a tough one for us because we live in a culture that continues to battle evil with evil in so many ways. Fighting evil with evil is like fighting fire with fire. What happens when we fight fire with fire? Everybody gets burned. I mean, there's going to be people who do evil things, who do abusive things to us or to others we know. We can't hide from that. Evil, violence, hate can be pointed right at us personally. So what do? Paul says you don't repay evil with evil. Repaying evil for evil, then only evil can win. It's like throwing gasoline on a smoldering fire. It's dangerous. It creates flames that consume everybody, the good, the bad, and bystanders as well. This is how wars get started between countries, repaying evil for evil. Fighting evil with evil is how wars start between neighbors. How violence so often raises its head inside of our families. So what should we do if we're subjected to evil or to violence? Well, first is to make sure you're safe. That's step one. Refusing to fight evil with evil does not mean that you set yourself up for repeated abuse. Then if possible, we need to talk, Paul says, talk to others about it. Because how are we going to know what's honorable and noble in the sight of all on our own? Then take time to pray, meditate, listen for God's guidance to direct you towards a way to respond that's not evil, but in a way that prevents or makes such evil less likely in the future. Act in a way that is honorable, not just from your standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the community as well. The standard Paul is describing may seem like a high bar to us, and it is a high bar, but it's behavior that becomes natural for someone who's Christ-like, for someone who's spiritually mature, for someone who's living their life as an expression of love. At the same time, Paul is not saying that people need to be spiritually mature to be part of the church either. That's not realistic. If that was the case, we'd have even fewer people in church, even if the weather was nice. Paul would still accept people into the church in an inclusive way, even if their behavior was not perfect, as long as it wasn't abusive, as long as it wasn't violent, and if there was an honest desire to be transformed through Jesus Christ. Sometimes the best response to evil or to an insult is no response at all. We shake off our boots, we forgive, and we move on. And there's a number of situations where that's true. For example, Paul recommends moving on when our response to evil is about revenge. If the main motive behind our response is to avenge ourselves, Paul says, stop right there. Paul says, never avenge ourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. Repaying evil for evil in order to achieve vengeance is not the same as taking steps to minimize evil in the future. Paul is not saying we should ignore bad things being done to ourselves or others. Instead, he's saying that to urge us to instead of that we repay evil with evil, or that we engage in evil in the name of pride or revenge, he's telling us that's not a Christian trait. And it's not the natural response of a Christ-like. Once Jesus touches your heart, you're not going to respond like that anymore to evil. Paul had to deal with two big questions in the early church. Should everybody be included? And what do we do about bad behavior? Same questions we have to deal with today. The type of people that churches exclude has evolved over the years, right? For many years, black people were not allowed. In today's world, who gets excluded? LGBTQ people often, for example, particularly trans people. Yet I think Paul's letter to Rome still holds wisdom for churches today, no matter the group we might be the subject of our disdain, the group that we might be looking down on now. Paul was trying to communicate his experience of Jesus Christ and to apply that experience to the practical problems the church was facing. And as it turns out, the problems that the church would continue to face for centuries to come. Over the years, Christian churches have found a lot of ways to argue over which people should or should not be included. And those they can be complicated. The question of whether women should be allowed to become ordained ministers. Some argue that Paul himself was not fully inclusive of women, but I'm not sure that's true. Of course, that question, the question of women in leadership and in ministry in our tradition, is a full and unqualified yes. In fact, the United Church of Christ is the only mainline Christian denomination that has more ordained female pastors than male. And like most other churches, we also have the most ordained LGBTQ pastors. Yeah, let's get off our high horse, though. We still have a lot of room to improve, a lot of room to grow, to be more inclusive, to be more loving. We're doing a lot, though, but not enough that we, for a second, start looking down on others as a result. Today's scripture gives us a chance to reflect, to consider. Have we been as inclusive as Paul envisioned? Do we strive to behave in ways that Paul taught the Roman church so long ago? I think we do, without getting on our high horse, in as much as we're able, in humble ways. But our journey continues. We're a long way from being perfect. And as we continue on our journey as an inclusive church, let us remember these teachings. To rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who weep, and as far as it depends on us, to live peacefully with all. Because having healthy relationships with God and each other and living in harmony with one another is one of the most important spiritual fruits available to us. as we grow closer to the example that is Jesus Christ.